everyone. Mr. Evans here with your pre-recorded lesson for Unit 6, Lesson 8 on genetically modified organisms. There's a lot of information out there about GMOs and the different types and what they do and what they don't do. So this is just going to be kind of a brief introduction to explain what some of those things are. I actually worked with genetically modified organisms for several years in a lab, um, tinkering with them. So I like to think I'm a little more knowledgeable than the average person on this subject. What we're looking at right now is a picture of a few different types of corn and tomatoes. What we have here in the terms of tomatoes are ordinary or unmodified tomatoes versus gene silenced tomatoes. And what we're looking at here is like on an ordinary unmodified tomato, they start to spoil rather rapidly. That's because tomatoes and all fruits and vegetables release a gas called ethylene. Ethylene is the naturally produced gas that causes things to ripen. And sometimes when we buy produce at the grocery store, it's already ripe or it's very close to ripe. And we don't necessarily want it to over ripen or spoil because maybe we're not going to eat it the same day. Or maybe it has a bit of a ways to travel from the farm to the grocery store. So a type of tomato called a gene silenced tomato was produced that actually turns off the ethylene gene, the genes that produce the ethylene after a certain point. So the tomatoes actually stay fresh a lot longer. They don't over-ripen and spoil as fast. A regular tomato, after about 20, 45 days, they're like rotten. But these tomatoes, since the ethylene gas has been silenced on a genetic level, they can last a lot longer. And it sometimes takes a while from the time you pick a tomato on the farm. You got to process it, put it through the factory, load it on the truck, drive it to the store. Then the consumer has to buy it and take it home, and maybe they're not going to use it for 3 or 4 days. So this is just a way to preserve our produce and make it last a little bit longer by turning off the ethylene gene. So that's why it's called gene silenced. So what is a genetically modified food? A genetically modified food is any kind of food that contains an added gene sequence, meaning that a gene has been added or taken away or suppressed through artificial means. They've gone in there and they've modified the DNA a certain way to either activate or deactivate a certain genetic sequence because they don't want that gene expressed, or maybe they want that gene overexpressed, because doing that has some kind of benefit to the food production line. Also classified as GMOs are um, animal products from animals that have been fed GMOs. So if like a cow is raised on genetically modified corn, that's what they feed the cow, then the milk from that cow is going to be classified as genetically modified, or the meat. And also any other products produced by genetically modified organisms. So it's just a term that is used to indicate that an organism has somehow been modified genetically. So why are they genetically modified? We have a lot of people in this world and a lot of people to feed, a lot of mouths to feed. And using traditional methods, like traditional organic methods, plows in the dirt, um, natural uh, food products that maybe don't grow as fast or produce as much fruit or seed or vegetable, it's not really feasible. There's too many people in the world to feed using traditional farming methods, especially when you think about meat products and animal products. Animals eat a lot of food. So you have to be able to produce a lot of corn, a lot of oats, a lot of barley, a lot of stuff to feed all these animals in order for them to grow up and be turned into hamburgers and bacon. So genetically modifying food rapidly increases the yield, which is the amount of food you get from that particular plant. And also, this is actually a very accurate way to make changes. And we'll get into that on this next slide. Traditionally, the way humans have dealt with their food production is through selective breeding. And this is something that humans have been doing for thousands of years, selective breeding. They would take the best looking fruit that had the biggest beautiful corn kernels and the most succulent apple and the juiciest tomato, and they would take seeds from that plant and replant them. And they would try to take two plants that had the best looking food on them and crossbreed them. They would pollinate them manually to try and get a seed from that, and then they would plant that seed. It's just like breeding dogs and cats, where you see a certain trait that you like in a dog or a cat, and you try to enhance that trait through breeding, selectively breeding which parents you want to have produce offspring. It's the same thing with plants, and it's something that just kind of happened naturally because of course it would. If you see the best corn, the corn cob, and it looks way better than the one next to it, that's the one you're going to replant because you want that one again next season. Native Americans did this with corn over thousands and thousands of years. What we're looking on the left right here is actually native, unselected corn. It was a little grass plant called teosinte. This was corn. This is the ancestor of corn, of what we eat off of the cob. It's just this little grass that had a few little seeds on it. And the Native Americans saw this and like, okay, well, we can eat these seeds, sure. Let's start farming them and let's use them in agriculture, but we're only going to pick the ones that have a lot of seeds on them, a lot of kernels, and that are bigger so that we have more food. So they replanted these and they crossbred and pollinated the biggest, most most productive plants. And after, thousands of years, this is what we have now, corn that we know and love. So some common GM foods are vegetables, tomatoes, potatoes, rice, cheese, meat, and pharmaceuticals. Just about everything that you eat in some form or another has some level of genetic modification in it. It's usually very small, usually has to do with just either keeping it preserved or increasing the yield. If a farmer can grow more food with less inputs, and when I say inputs, I mean things like pesticides, herbicides, chemicals, fertilizers, that kind of stuff. That's called an input for a farmer. If the farmer doesn't have to do that, it's cheaper and the food is easier to grow and it's cheaper and it's more widely available for the masses. There are several types of genetically modified food that are resistant to insects that do not require a whole lot of fertilizer, things like that. So unless you raise your own livestock and gather nuts and berries from the forest, you've been eating genetically modified stuff your whole life. Just kind of the way the modern world works. So how is genetic modification possible? Well, as we've been learning, all life on Earth uses the same DNA code. We all have DNA, whether you are a nematode or an apple tree or a human, everything on Earth uses DNA. And a lot of times those DNA sequences, the genes that code for certain things, are interchangeable. So if the technology exists to take a gene out of one organism and put it into another, sometimes that will work. Usually it will not. They are not all completely interchangeable. And in a lot of cases, it takes like hundreds or thousands of genes to make an actual physical change in the organism. But with enough research and enough tinkering, you can kind of figure out which genes you can enhance and which ones you can turn off and which ones maybe you can swap out, and you can see what happens. And you do experiments and you do research and you do trials to see what the overall result is. So how do you do that? You find an organism with the desired trait. Okay, I want to make a glow in the dark tomato. Okay, they don't really make glow in the dark tomatoes, but they could. There is a very easy way to do it. They just don't because nobody wants to eat a glow in the dark tomato. but this is just an easy example. So there are several marine organisms that have bioluminescence. They glow in the dark, and this is something they do for hunting, as a survival skill. They glow in the dark. They're bioluminescent. You can actually take that gene out of that marine organism and put it into a tomato plant and get it to fluoresce. Um, and you can do it with other plants too. This is actually a lab technique that engineers do just to see if a different gene that they want to transfer has been transferred. So let's say I have a gene that I want that will make the tomato uh, grow faster. Okay, just an example. But if I transfer that gene from one organism into the tomato, how can I know if it worked? You can't really just tell by looking at the tomato. But let's say I attach that gene to a glow in the dark gene. I just stuck them together and I transferred both of them into the tomato. Well, now the tomato glows in the dark, I know that the gene that I wanted in there is in there too because I had attached the two together. Um, so that's how you do it. You take the gene of interest and you insert it into the target organism, and then you just allow the plant to grow up. And sometimes it takes a few weeks to know if it worked. It's patient work. So the last slide we're going to look at here is about the pros and cons of genetically modified foods. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There are trade-offs in everything humans do. you know, if you want to walk to the store, yeah, you're walking to the store. You're going to get your candy bars. You're going to get your snack foods. But guess what? Every time you step out the door, you're taking a risk. It's just a question of how much risk. And that's what genetically modified foods are about. And that's what this slide is about that we're going to look at. So one example here is called BT corn. It's called Bacillus thuringiensis corn. And this is a genetically modified corn that has something called Bt toxin in it. It is completely harmless to humans and mammals and higher uh, organisms, but it is deadly to an insect called the corn borer. Anyone who's ever gotten some corn and maybe you see like some of the kernels have been blackened and kind of eaten and it's a little gross looking, there's like holes in it. That's from this little guy right here called the corn borer. And this genetically modified corn has Bt toxin in the leaves. So as soon as the corn borer takes a bite of a leaf, falls over dead in like 5 minutes. Harmless to humans and animals, but it is deadly to the corn borer. This type of corn, the insects, these corn borers can't eat this corn anymore. So the yield of a cornfield has gone way up since this type of corn was introduced. You just get a lot more corn because it's not being eaten by this little insect. So that's the pro. You get increased yield. But there's also a con. The con could be maybe different insects are that aren't as big of a threat are also eating the corn and they're dying too. So it's a side effect of this. Another like side effect is some leaves, some corn stalks, whatever, they get caught up in an irrigation ditch and they get washed downstream. And now you have insects that aren't even anywhere near the field eating the corn too and dying. Again, um, non-target creatures are dying as a result of using this. But it's a trade-off. You get a whole lot more corn, but you're going to have some unintended side effects down the line. And that's kind of what you have to ask yourself in terms of all GMO foods. First off, all of this stuff is very, very, very heavily tested and constantly monitored to make sure that it's safe. And been using genetically modified organisms for going on 20 years now, and there have not been any widespread issues with them, other than the stuff that's like already known, like the target insects eating it when we don't necessarily want them to. So we do know about some of the unwanted effects in terms of ecology, but haven't really found anything in terms of bad health effects to eating them. um, but you have to weigh that against the benefit. The benefit being you get a whole lot more food for a whole lot less cost. The the world has become much less hungry as a result of genetically modified foods just because there is so much more food available and it is so much easier to grow. Um, this is a lesson that could take up a very long time, but we are not going to take up a very long time. We're going to go ahead and stop it right there. So thanks everyone for watching this pre-recorded live lesson, and your multiple choice question is coming up right now.